The Rwandan Civil War was a major conflict in Rwanda, waged between the Rwandan Armed Forces and the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, from October 1, 1990 to July 18, 1994. The war stemmed from long-standing tensions between the Hutu and Tutsi groups. In 1959, a revolution ended the Tutsi monarchy and established a Hutu-led republic, causing over 336,000 Tutsi to flee to neighboring countries. A faction of these exiled Tutsi in Uganda formed the RPF, which became a formidable military force under leaders Fred Rwigema and Paul Kagame. The conflict began on October 1, 1990, when the RPF launched an incursion into northeastern Rwanda, advancing 60 kilometers into the country. However, their advance was hindered by Rwigema's death on the second day. Supported by French troops, the Rwandan army initially defeated the RPF by the end of October. Paul Kagame then assumed command, withdrawing RPF forces to the Virunga Mountains before commencing guerrilla warfare. This stalemate continued until mid-1992, when public protests prompted Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana to begin peace talks with the RPF and other domestic opposition groups. Despite violence from Hutu extremists and a fresh RPF offensive in 1993, the Arusha Accords were signed in August 1993, aiming to bring peace. A fragile peace followed, with RPF troops stationed in Kigali and the UNAMIR peacekeeping mission deployed. Meanwhile, the extremist Hutu power faction was planning the extermination of the Tutsi population. The plan was set into motion after President Habyarimana's assassination on April 6, 1994, sparking the Rwandan Genocide. Over approximately 100 days, between 500,000 and 1 million Tutsi and moderate Hutu were killed. The RPF resumed its offensive, capturing territory, rapidly encircling cities and blocking supply routes. By mid-June, they surrounded the capital, Kigali, capturing it on July 4th. The war concluded later in July when the RPF seized the last government-held areas, forcing the Hutu government and genocide perpetrators to flee to Zaire. With the RPF victorious, Paul Kagame emerged as Rwanda's de facto leader, later serving as vice president in 1994 and president from 2000. The RPF initiated efforts to rebuild Rwanda's infrastructure, prosecute genocide perpetrators, and promote reconciliation between Hutu and Tutsi. In 1996, the RPF-led government launched an assault on refugee camps in Zaire, where exiled leaders of the former regime and many Hutu refugees had taken shelter. This action ignited the First Congo War, which ultimately toppled Zaire's dictator, Mobutu Sese Seko. As of 2024, Kagame and the RPF continue to hold significant influence in Rwandan politics. Please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel, Africarized, for more videos about African history, facts, and stories. Like, share, and leave a comment. Background of pre-independence Rwanda and the origins of Hutu, Tutsi, and TWA. The earliest known inhabitants of what is now Rwanda were the TWA, indigenous pygmy hunter-gatherers, who settled in the area between 8,000 and 3,000 BC. Over the centuries, Bantu groups began migrating to the region, clearing forests for agriculture between 700 BC and 1500 AD. This shift pushed many of the forest-dwelling TWA to the mountainous regions. Historians propose several theories about these migrations. One suggests that the Hutu were the initial Bantu settlers, with the Tutsi arriving later as a distinct group, potentially originating from the Horn of Africa. Another theory posits that the migration was gradual, with groups integrating into a unified society rather than forming a new, distinct population, leading to a social distinction between Hutu and Tutsi rather than a racial one. As these groups coalesced, They organized into clans, or 𝒂𝒊𝒂𝒐, and by 1700 around 8 kingdoms had formed. The Kingdom of Rwanda, ruled by the 𝒑𝒓𝒐𝒏𝒚 clan, rose to prominence by the mid-18th century, largely through conquest and assimilation. Its peak came under King Kigali Rwabugiri, who reigned from 1853 to 1895. He expanded the kingdom's territory and introduced administrative changes that heightened divisions between the Hutu and Tutsi. Under Rwabugiri, the 𝒂𝒐𝒂𝒏𝒚𝒔 forced labor system required Hutu to work to regain access to land, and 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒏 bound Hutu and Tutsi to Tutsi patrons in exchange for cattle and services, which intensified the class divide. In 1884, Germany claimed Rwanda and neighboring Burundi during the Berlin Conference. German officials began establishing alliances with Rwanda's monarchy in 1897, ruling through the Tutsi-dominated royal system and thereby enforcing colonial rule with minimal European forces. The Germans viewed the Tutsi as racially superior, believing them to be descendants of Ethiopian migrants, and favored them in administration roles, a policy that consolidated the Tutsis' dominance. Belgian forces seized control of Rwanda and Burundi during World War I and, starting in 1926, moved toward direct colonial governance. The Belgians, in coordination with Catholic missionaries, modernized Rwanda's economy but also imposed heavy taxes and forced labor. Tutsi privilege persisted, supported by Belgian authorities, which left the Hutu with limited social and economic rights. In 1935, the Belgians formalized ethnic divisions by introducing identity cards that categorized individuals as Tutsi, Hutu, TWA, or naturalized, effectively ending the social mobility that had allowed some Hutu to become honorary Tutsi based on wealth or status. In the years following World War II, a Hutu counter-elite emerged in Rwanda, demanding a transfer of power from the Tutsi elite to the Hutu majority. In the years following World War II, a Hutu counter-elite emerged in Rwanda, demanding a transfer of power from the Tutsi elite to the Hutu majority. This period also saw a shift within the Catholic Church in Rwanda, with younger working-class clergy, mainly Flemish, sympathizing with the Hutu cause. In November 1959, false rumors spread that a Hutu sub-chief had been killed by Tutsi activists, sparking widespread riots and arson targeting Tutsi homes. In response, Tutsi leaders launched a counter-offensive to regain control, but they were thwarted by Belgian Colonel 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒏𝒚𝒔, who stepped in to restore order and began actively promoting the Hutu elite. In 1961, 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒏𝒚𝒔 and Hutu leader 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒅 declared Rwanda an autonomous republic, achieving full independence in 1962. The Hutu-led government initiated violent purges against the Tutsi, forcing over 336,000 to flee to neighboring countries. Tutsi exiles, largely based in Uganda, formed armed groups to reclaim their homeland, though these Inyenzi cockroach attacks were poorly organized and ultimately unsuccessful. For the next decade, Kayibanda presided over an autocratic Hutu-led republic. However, in 1973, Army officer Juvenal Habyarimana overthrew Kayibanda in a coup. While anti-Tutsi policies continued, the country enjoyed relative stability and economic growth until a coffee price collapse in the late 1980s strained the economy. Habyarimana's in-laws, known as the Akazu, increasingly wielded influence over the country, especially in the northwest. Mounting economic challenges led to civil unrest, which pressured Habyarimana to pledge reforms toward multi-party democracy, though no immediate actions followed. Formation of the RPF and preparations for conflict. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, originated in Uganda in 1979. Initially, it was known as the Rwandan Refugees Welfare Association, but later it became the Rwandan Alliance for National Unity, or RANU. It was formed in response to the discrimination Tutsi refugees faced under Ugandan President Milton Obote, who accused them of supporting 𝒂𝐢𝐻𝒐𝒏𝙚𝒍 regime. Tutsi refugees 𝒂𝒑𝒉𝙤𝒐𝒏𝙚 and Paul Kagame joined Ugandan leader Yoweri Museveni's National Resistance Army, which fought Obote's forces during the Ugandan Bush War. After Museveni's NRA seized Kampala in 1986, 𝒂𝒉𝙤𝒐𝒏𝙚 and Kagame assumed key positions in the Ugandan military. Inspired by their successes, they began planning a return to Rwanda. By 1987, RANU rebranded as the RPF, aiming to return the refugees to Rwanda peacefully if possible. In 1988, 𝒂𝒉𝙤𝒐𝒏𝙚 became RPF president, while Kagame served as vice president. Tensions arose as certain factions attempted an uncoordinated invasion of Rwanda in 1989, but it was quickly quashed by Rwandan forces. As the number of Tutsi in the Ugandan military grew, 𝒂𝒑𝒉𝙤𝒻 raised concerns with Museveni, leading to the demotion of 𝒂𝒉𝙤𝒻 and Kagame. When a land dispute in Uganda intensified anti-Rwandan sentiment, labeling all refugees as non-citizens, 𝒂𝒉𝙤𝒻 and Kagame accelerated plans to invade Rwanda. President Museveni may have been aware of their intentions but did not officially endorse them. Museveni even sent Kagame for military training in the United States to potentially delay the invasion. Nonetheless, by mid-1990, the RPF was set on launching its mission to reclaim Rwanda for the exiled Tutsi population. On October 1, 1990, around 50 rebels from the Rwandan Patriotic Front, or RPF, defected from the Ugandan army and crossed into Rwanda, sparking a violent conflict by killing a Rwandan customs guard at the Kagitumba border post. Hundreds more rebels soon followed, equipped with stolen Ugandan military weapons, including machine guns, mortars, and multiple rocket launchers. The initial RPF force comprised about 2,500 soldiers from the Ugandan Army's ranks, joined by 800 civilians who provided medical and logistical support. Both Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni and Rwandan President 𝒂𝒑𝒉𝙤𝒻 were attending a United Nations summit in New York when the invasion began, and in a matter of days, the RPF had advanced 60 kilometers south to 𝒂𝒑𝒉𝙗, catching the Rwandan armed forces off guard. On October 2nd, RPF leader 𝒂𝒑𝒉𝙤𝒻 was killed under unclear circumstances. Official accounts suggested a stray bullet, while other sources, such as historian Gérard Prunier, speculate 𝒂𝒉𝙤𝒻 was shot by his sub-commander, Peter Bayingana, during an argument over strategy. 𝒂𝒉𝙤𝒻 favored a gradual approach to winning over Hutu support, while Bayingana and fellow sub-commander Chris Bunyanyezi preferred an aggressive advance toward Kigali. In response to the RPF's rapid advance, 𝒂𝒑𝒉𝙤𝒻 requested military support from France. The French government, led by Jean-Christophe Mitterrand, son of President François Mitterrand, quickly sent 600 soldiers under Operation Noroi. Officially, the mission was to protect French nationals in Rwanda, but the French forces actively supported 𝒂𝒑𝒉𝙤𝒻's regime, establishing defensive positions to block the RPF's approach to Kigali and the airport. Troops from Belgium and Zaire also arrived, though Belgian forces mainly focused on protecting Belgian citizens. Reports of arbitrary arrests and massacres of Tutsi by 𝒂𝒑𝒉𝙤𝒻's regime prompted public controversy in Belgium, leading to the withdrawal of its troops by early November. With French military backing and the demoralizing impact of 𝒂𝒉𝙤𝒻's death, the Rwandan army regained control, pushing the RPF back to the Ugandan border by the end of October. Many RPF soldiers deserted, some returning to Uganda, while others hid in the Akagera National Park. 𝒂𝒑𝒉𝙤𝒻 accused Uganda of supporting the RPF's efforts, alleging that a command base had been established in Kampala to coordinate the invasion. By October 30th, the Rwandan government declared the war over. The Rwandan government used the supposed RPF attack on Kigali as justification for the mass arrest of over 8,000 individuals, primarily Tutsi political opponents. This marked an escalation of anti-Tutsi sentiment. Radio Rwanda broadcast ethnic hatred, and local authorities organized a massacre in Kibelira commune in Gisenyi province on October 11th, killing 383 Tutsi. Though officials responsible for the killings were initially removed and jailed, they were released shortly thereafter. This event marked the first large-scale massacre of Tutsi in nearly 2 decades, significantly heightening ethnic tensions across Rwanda. At the onset of the war in October 1990, Paul Kagame was in the United States, attending a military course at Fort Leavenworth. He had been closely coordinating with RPF leader 𝒑𝒓𝒂𝒏𝒚 by phone, finalizing details of the upcoming invasion. In late September, Kagame informed the college that he was leaving the course to return to Africa. He departed with textbooks from the course, which he would later reference for tactical planning. After learning of 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒚's death on October 5th, Kagame quickly made his way back, flying through London and Addis Ababa before arriving at Entebbe airport. With the help of Ugandan connections, he crossed into Rwanda on October 15th, bypassing potential arrest due to Museveni's absence and lack of specific orders from the Ugandan police. Upon arrival, Kagame found the RPF in disarray, demoralized by 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒚's death and early losses. The troops, many of whom had served with Kagame in the Ugandan army, welcomed his return. After assessing the situation, Kagame ordered a strategic withdrawal from northeastern Rwanda to the rugged Virunga Mountains in the northwest, recognizing that the challenging terrain would offer them protection from government forces. During the week-long march to the mountains, the RPF occasionally crossed into Uganda with President Museveni's tacit permission, benefiting from friendships with former colleagues in the Ugandan army. To distract the Rwandan army, some RPF soldiers remained behind to conduct minor skirmishes, concealing the broader relocation. The RPF soon shifted to guerrilla tactics, beginning with an attack on a Rwandan customs post which provoked accusations from Rwanda that Uganda was sheltering the RPF. The RPF's new approach inflicted heavy casualties on government forces, leading them to shell Ugandan territory, damaging property and leading to civilian casualties. There were also reports of Rwandan forces crossing into Uganda to loot and abduct civilians. The Virunga Mountains presented harsh conditions with altitudes nearing 5,000 meters. Without adequate food, supplies, or warm clothing, some RPF soldiers froze to death or suffered serious injuries from the cold. Kagame focused on reorganizing the RPF during this period, avoiding direct conflict and concentrating on structure and discipline. Former Hutu Colonel Alexis Kanyarengwe, who had fallen out with Habyarimana, joined the RPF and was appointed chairman, while Seth Sendashonga, another Hutu, became the RPF's liaison with opposition parties in Rwanda. Most other high-ranking recruits were Ugandan-based Tutsi. The RPF's ranks grew as volunteers arrived from Tutsi communities in Burundi, Zaire, and other nations. Kagame emphasized discipline and rigorous training, establishing strict conduct rules for the soldiers, which included paying for goods, abstaining from alcohol and drugs, and building a positive reputation among locals. Violations of these rules were punished. More serious offenses like murder, rape, and desertion were met with the death penalty. The RPF also launched a fundraising initiative, managed by Financial Commissioner 𝒂𝒐𝒂𝒏𝒚, to gather donations from the global Tutsi diaspora and supportive Rwandan business people. Although funds were modest, careful financial management enabled the RPF to expand its operations. They acquired weapons from the open market, leveraging Cold War-era surpluses, and it is likely they also received arms from loyalists within the Ugandan army, as suggested by historian 𝒂𝒑𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒂💏. President Museveni, aware of this support, was able to diplomatically deny knowledge to avoid international repercussions. Museveni later acknowledged Uganda's limited support for the RPF, noting that its defeat would have been detrimental to Tutsi Rwandans and Uganda's own stability. Journalist Justus Muhanguzi-Kampe observed that the Ugandan army's desertion of military resources to the RPF strained Uganda's defense budget, resulting in significant financial costs. In January 1991, after 3 months of regrouping, Paul Kagame decided that the RPF was ready to go back on the offensive. The target was the northern city of 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝙚𝒍, strategically located just south of the Virunga Mountains. 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚 was not only accessible from the RPF's mountainous base, but also symbolically significant. The region was home to President Habyarimana, his wife and her influential family, making it a stronghold of the regime. Kagame aimed to make a bold statement with an attack there, hoping to destabilize the government and assert the RPF's presence. On the night of January 22nd, around 700 RPF fighters descended from the mountains to secret positions around the city with support from local sympathizers. At dawn on January 23rd, they launched their attack, catching Rwandan forces off guard. While the Rwandan police and army put up a brief resistance, repelling RPF fighters near their stations and inflicting heavy losses, the defense ultimately collapsed. French paratroopers may have also been involved in the rear guard, as France later acknowledged and rewarded several soldiers who participated. By noon, the RPF had captured 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚, causing most civilians to flee the city. One of the RPF's primary objectives was the prison, the largest in Rwanda. Upon hearing of the attack, the prison warden, Charles Uwihoreye, contacted Kigali for guidance. Colonel 𝒂𝒐𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒂💏, a member of the ruling 𝒂𝐭𝐻 elite, ordered him to execute all inmates to prevent escapes and avoid any defections to the RPF, especially among high-profile political prisoners. Uwihoreye refused, even after 𝒂𝒂💂💏 confirmed the directive with the president. When the RPF reached the prison, they freed the inmates, some of whom, like former Habyarimana ally Theoneste Lizinde, joined their ranks. The RPF held 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚 for the remainder of January 23rd, before withdrawing into the mountains overnight. The bold raid challenged government claims that the RPF had been driven out of Rwanda and reduced to minor guerrilla skirmishes from Uganda. In response, the government sent reinforcements to 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚 and imposed a state of emergency, enforcing strict curfews in the area. For several months, the RPF conducted night raids on the city, keeping the conflict active. Guerrilla War, 1991 to 1992. Following 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚, the RPF resumed a guerrilla warfare strategy. The Rwandan army concentrated forces in the north, occupying strategic locations and shelling RPF positions in the Virunga Mountains. However, the rugged terrain hindered a full-scale assault, allowing Kagame's forces to launch coordinated attacks at various points across the northern region, keeping the army spread thin. The conflict dragged on as both sides launched frequent strikes, making territorial gains without decisive outcomes. The RPF captured Gatuna, a border town crucial for its strategic location on the northern corridor, blocking Rwanda's access to Mombasa and forcing the country to rely on the longer, costlier central corridor route through Tanzania. By late 1991, the RPF controlled around 5% of Rwanda, establishing a headquarters in an abandoned tea factory in Mulindi, Bayomba province. Many Hutu civilians in RPF-occupied territories fled to government-controlled areas, adding to the growing number of internally displaced persons. This renewed warfare had two major repercussions within Rwanda. Firstly, anti-Tutsi violence surged, incited by local officials. Hutu extremists targeted Tutsi civilians, killing up to 1,000 individuals in coordinated attacks across the northwest, starting with a massacre of Bagogwe Tutsi pastoralists near Kinigi. These attacks continued until mid-1991, after which the government allowed potential targets to relocate to safer areas like Kigali. At the same time, the 𝒂𝐂𝐧𝒑 launched an aggressive propaganda campaign, spreading anti-Tutsi messaging to foster ethnic division. The infamous Hutu 10 Commandments were published in Kangura magazine, pushing for Hutu supremacy and casting Tutsi as outsiders and enemies of the Hutu people. In response, the RPF set up Radio Muhabara, broadcasting from Uganda to counter the government's narrative. Although initially unpopular, the station's reach grew in the following years. The second impact was President 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚's announcement of political reforms under pressure from international allies, including France. In mid-1991, he formally allowed multi-party politics, which led to the formation of various opposition groups such as the Republican Democratic Movement, also known as MDR, the Social Democratic Party, or PSD, and the Liberal Party, PL. However, these reforms were largely symbolic. 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚's regime maintained control over the country's administrative structure. The Hardline Coalition for the Defense of the Republic, or CDR, also emerged during this time, closely aligned with the 𝒂𝒂𝐳 and more extreme than 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚's party. Despite slow progress, 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚 eventually yielded to pressure in January 1992, forming a multi-party cabinet that included some opposition leaders. This coalition led to preliminary negotiations with the RPF, resulting in a ceasefire by July 1992. Both sides began peace talks in Arusha, Tanzania, marking a tentative step toward resolving the conflict. The Rwandan peace process was complex, with four main factions, each pursuing its own agenda. The first group consisted of Hutu hardliners, including Agatha 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚's family, represented by the CDR and MRND extremists. This faction viewed compromise as a threat to Hutu dominance. The second group was the official opposition, which, while more democratic, remained wary of the RPF, perceiving it as a potential threat to the Hutu-led government established after the 1959 revolution. The third faction was the RPF, led by Paul Kagame. Though some senior RPF leaders advised against it, Kagame engaged in negotiations, aware that shunning peace could damage the RPF's political standing and erode international support. The final faction was President 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚's inner circle, which publicly advocated a compromise but worked behind the scenes to delay changes and preserve 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚's power. In mid-1992, 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚 attempted to weaken the hardliners within the army, but key figures like Augustin Ndindilimana and Theoneste Bagosora retained influence, keeping hardline elements in powerful positions. Meanwhile, Arusha negotiations in late 1992 yielded an agreement for a pluralistic transitional government that would include the RPF. This angered Hutu hardliners, who began targeting Tutsi civilians, killing 85 and destroying 500 homes in Kibuye. Historian Gérard Prunier identifies this period as the point when plans for a final solution against Tutsi in Rwanda began taking shape. The extremists also established shadow networks within the army and state, positioning themselves as the ultimate protectors of Hutu power and working to undermine any peace agreements reached in Arusha. Tensions escalated in early 1993 when a power-sharing agreement was signed at Arusha, allotting positions among the MRND, RPF, and other opposition parties, but excluding the CDR. This agreement represented a shift towards a transitional government and eventual elections. While 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚 and moderate opposition leaders accepted the arrangement, MRND hardliners and the CDR rejected it. MRND's secretary, 𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂𝒂�ъ� publicly announced the party's refusal to honor the agreement, directly opposing the president and the negotiators. Violent demonstrations and a broader killing spree of Tutsi civilians ensued, with hundreds of deaths and widespread destruction in northwestern Rwanda. RPF offensive, February 1993. In response to this violence, Kagame withdrew from the Arusha process and resumed hostilities, ending a 6-month ceasefire. While the RPF cited the hardliners' violence as the primary cause, some analysts believe the offensive was partly intended to strengthen the RPF's negotiating position, particularly regarding the composition of the future national army. The RPF launched its offensive on February 8th, advancing south from its base in northern Rwanda. This time, the Rwandan army offered little resistance due to low morale and inadequate training among its new, poorly disciplined recruits. The economic toll of the protracted conflict and a significant devaluation of the Rwandan franc had left the government struggling to pay soldiers, who resorted to abusing civilians. The RPF's southward advance was swift, capturing Rwenzori on the first day and subsequently Byumba. Thousands of Hutu civilians fled these areas, relocating to camps outside Kigali. Estimates of civilian casualties vary, with some reports suggesting several thousand deaths. The offensive and the resultant civilian displacement alienated some potential allies in Rwanda's democratic opposition. Realizing the severity of the situation, Habyarimana urgently requested French assistance. France, concerned about the RPF's proximity to Kigali, deployed 150 troops and provided additional arms to the Rwandan army. Another 250 French soldiers arrived on February 20th, bolstering Rwandan forces and halting the RPF's progress southward. French artillery significantly impacted the RPF's advance, and by February 20th, the RPF had reached within 30 kilometers or 19 miles of Kigali. Despite nearing the capital, the RPF did not launch an assault. Kagame later revealed that he had not intended to capture Kigali, as doing so might have harmed the RPF's international standing, possibly branding the movement as a force seeking to replace Hutu rule with a Tutsi regime. Additionally, French reinforcements and strong government support among Hutu civilians would have made an assault on Kigali challenging. Although some RPF officers advocated for a decisive victory, Kagame opted for a ceasefire instead. By the end of February, the fighting had displaced over 1 million civilians, mostly Hutu, marking Rwanda's largest population displacement to date. Arusha Accords and the Rise of Hutu Power, 1993 to 1994. The ceasefire by the RPF led to 2 days of intense negotiations in Kampala, Uganda, with RPF leader Paul Kagame, Ugandan President Museveni, and European representatives in attendance. The European representatives pushed for the RPF to withdraw to its previous position before the February offensive. Kagame agreed, but only if the Rwandan army was restricted from entering newly gained RPF territory. After Kagame threatened further offensive actions, a compromise was reached. The RPF would withdraw, but a demilitarized zone would be established between RPF-controlled areas and the rest of Rwanda. This arrangement marked a significant acknowledgement by Habyarimana's government of the RPF's presence in the north. While some within the RPF command felt Kagame had conceded too much, his authority and prior success allowed him to override these concerns and bring the focus back to peace negotiations in Arusha. Despite the ongoing negotiations, President Habyarimana, with French support, worked to form a common front against the RPF, including members of his own MRND party, the extremist CDR, and factions from other opposition parties involved in the power-sharing coalition. However, moderate members of these same parties joined the RPF in condemning French involvement and called for strict adherence to the Arusha process. This split gave rise to the Hutu power movement, which was not confined to any single party, but instead saw nearly all parties divided between moderates and Hutu power extremists. Even within the ruling MRND, the power faction opposed 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝙚𝒍's peace efforts. Radical youth militias also emerged, aligned with the power factions, including the Interahamwe, linked to the MRND, and the 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒂𝒏, aligned with the CDR. These militias, trained with support from the army and unknowingly French forces, began perpetrating violence across Rwanda. By June 1993, 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚 saw the Hutu power movement as a greater threat to his rule than the moderate opposition, prompting him to engage more seriously in the Arusha peace talks. Historian 𝒑𝒓𝒐𝒒𝒂𝒣𝒐 suggests that 𝒂𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚's support for the peace process was largely symbolic, as he sought to maintain control by making limited concessions to both the opposition and the RPF. The negotiation of military positions proved difficult, with the Rwandan government initially proposing that the RPF hold only 15% of the officer positions, reflective of the Tutsi population share, while the RPF pushed for an equal 50-50 split. Backed by Tanzania, the RPF ultimately succeeded in securing this balance, along with 40% of non-command troop positions. The agreement also called for significant demobilization. From a combined total of 55,000 soldiers, only 19,000 would remain in a unified national army. The Arusha Accords were formally signed on August 4, 1993, with 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝒚 and regional leaders in attendance. This fragile peace would last until April 7th of the following year. The agreement led to the deployment of a United Nations peacekeeping force, the United Nations Assistance Mission for Rwanda, also known as UNAMIR, which arrived in October 1993 under Canadian General Romeo Dallaire. Another provision allowed the RPF to establish a diplomatic presence in Kigali at the National Assembly building, guarded by 600 to 1,000 RPF soldiers who arrived through UNAMIR's Operation Clean Corridor in December 1993. Meanwhile, the Hutu power factions within various parties continued planning for large-scale violence. The October 1993 assassination of Melchior Ndadaye, Burundi's first elected Hutu president, by Tutsi extremists intensified anti-Tutsi sentiment, with Hutu power advocates capitalizing on this event. What had once been a fringe call for a final solution against Tutsi now became central to their agenda. In early 1994, an Interahamwe informant warned UNAMIR officials that Hutu extremists were preparing to derail the peace process and massacre Tutsis in Kigali, setting the stage for the tragic events that would follow. On April 6, 1994, a ceasefire was abruptly shattered when a plane carrying Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana and Burundian President Cyprien Ntaryamira was shot down near Kigali Airport, killing both leaders. They had been returning from a regional summit in Dar es Salaam, where East African leaders urged Habyarimana to proceed with the implementation of the Arusha Accords. While the attackers remain unidentified, early analyses such as 𝒑𝒓𝒐𝒒𝒂𝒣𝒐's suggested that extreme Hutu elements within Habyarimana's government may have orchestrated the attack. French and Spanish judges later alleged RPF involvement, though subsequent investigations cast doubt on these claims, leading to the dismissal of charges against RPF officials in 2018 due to insufficient evidence. The downing of Habyarimana's plane triggered the Rwandan Genocide almost immediately, with extremist Hutu leaders forming a crisis committee led by Colonel Théoneste Bagosora. They disregarded the legal successor, Prime Minister Agatha Uwilingiyimana, whom UN Commander General Romeo Dallaire recognized as the rightful leader. Bagosora's forces, however, refused Dallaire's insistence and instead murdered Uwilingiyimana, her husband, and 10 Belgian peacekeepers guarding her, along with other prominent moderate politicians and journalists. This crisis committee appointed an interim government that, under Bagosora's influence, ordered systematic massacres of Tutsi and moderate Hutu. Over the next 100 days, these operations led to the deaths of between 500,000 and 1 million people. On April 7th, as the genocide began, RPF commander Paul Kagame issued a warning to the interim government and UN peacekeepers, vowing to resume military action if the killings continued. Rwandan army forces then launched an attack on the National Parliament building, but the RPF forces stationed there successfully repelled it. The RPF proceeded across the demilitarized zone and launched a three-front attack, causing confusion among government forces. RPF units advanced steadily southward, capturing Gabiro and substantial areas east and north of Kigali. Although isolated from the main force, RPF troops in Kigali were reinforced by young soldiers who traversed government-held territory to join them. The RPF avoided attacking Kigali directly, instead focusing on maneuvers to encircle the city and cut off supply routes while allowing Tutsi refugees to seek shelter behind their lines. Throughout April, the UN made repeated attempts to establish a ceasefire, but Kagame refused, insisting the RPF would not stop fighting until the genocide ceased. By late April, the RPF had secured the entire Tanzanian border area and began advancing westward. Their progress encountered minimal resistance except near Kigali and Ruwenzori. By mid-May, they had severed the road between Kigali and Gitarama, the temporary base of the interim government, which they subsequently captured on June 13th. This forced the government to retreat to Gisenyi in the northwest. Kagame also recruited new forces during this period, including Tutsi survivors and refugees from Burundi, although these recruits were less disciplined and experienced than earlier RPF fighters. In late June, France launched Operation Turquoise, a UN-backed humanitarian mission to establish safe zones for civilians. French troops entered southwestern Rwanda from bases in Goma and Bukavu in Zaire, creating a turquoise zone within the 𝒑𝒓𝒂𝙗𝒏𝙚𝒔 triangle, covering about a fifth of Rwanda. While Radio France International estimates that turquoise saved approximately 15,000 lives, many Rwandans viewed it as a protective measure for Hutus, including perpetrators of the genocide. The French presence also hindered the RPF's southward advance. Operation Turquoise concluded on August 21, 1994, but sparked extensive debate over French foreign policy and military actions in Africa. By late June, the RPF had encircled Kigali, intensifying its fight for control of the capital. Despite the government forces' numerical and logistical advantages, the RPF steadily gained ground and conducted rescue operations for civilians trapped in enemy territory. According to 𝒩𝒐𝒐𝒊𝒔𝒆, Kagame skillfully employed psychological tactics, taking advantage of the government's focus on genocide rather than defending Kigali, and exploiting their declining morale as they lost territory. The RPF ultimately defeated the Rwandan army in Kigali on July 4th, and on July 18th captured Gisenyi, forcing the interim government into exile in Zaire. This RPF victory marked the end of both the genocide and the civil war. Rwanda commemorates July 4th, the fall of Kigali, as Liberation Day, a public holiday. The UN peacekeeping mission, UNAMIR, was present during the genocide, but was constrained by its Chapter 6 mandate, which limited its ability to intervene militarily. Dahler's peace-brokering efforts were unsuccessful, and most Rwandan UNAMIR staff were killed in the early days, severely restricting their operations. UNAMIR did, however, provide refuge for thousands of Tutsi and moderate Hutu at sites like the Amahoro Stadium and assisted in evacuating foreign nationals. After the deaths of 10 Belgian peacekeepers, Belgium withdrew its troops in mid-April, significantly weakening the UN force. By mid-May, the UN finally acknowledged the genocide and authorized reinforcements, which arrived in June. Following the genocide's end in July, UNAMIR remained in Rwanda to assist with stabilization efforts until its mission concluded in 1996. UNAMIR lost 15 soldiers during the genocide, including the 10 Belgians, 3 Ghanaians, a Uruguayan, and Senegalese captain 𝒂𝒊𝒐𝒏𝙚𝒂𝒣, who repeatedly risked his life to save Rwandans. Following the RPF's victory after the genocide, they assumed control of Rwanda, remaining the dominant political force in the country as of 2021. The new government was loosely based on the Arusha Accords, but Habyarimana's party was banned, and the RPF took over the government positions allocated to it under the Accords. The military wing of the RPF was renamed the Rwandan Patriotic Army, or RPA, and became the National Army. Paul Kagame took on the roles of Vice President and Minister of Defense, while Pasteur Bizimungu, a Hutu who had joined the RPF after previously serving as a civil servant under Habyarimana, was appointed president. While Bizimungu and his cabinet handled some domestic affairs, Kagame retained command over the army and wielded the real political power. The civil war had severely impacted Rwanda's economy, halting coffee and tea production, disrupting tourism, reducing food output, and shifting government spending towards defense. The genocide further ravaged the country's infrastructure and economy, with many buildings left unusable, and the former regime had taken currency and movable assets when fleeing. Over 40% of the population was either killed or forced to flee, leaving a predominantly female population. Women made up around 70% of the country, as many men had either been killed or had fled. In addition to the combatant casualties, approximately 7,500 soldiers lost their lives during the war. Many survivors were left traumatized, having lost family members or witnessed atrocities. War rape had lasting consequences, including social stigma, diseases, and unwanted pregnancies, with some women resorting to self-induced abortions. Kagame's army maintained law and order as the government set to work rebuilding institutions and infrastructure. Though non-governmental organizations began returning to Rwanda, the international community largely funneled aid to refugee camps in Zaire, where many Hutu had fled. Kagame sought to present an inclusive government, removing ethnic distinctions from national identity cards and downplaying divisions between Hutu, Tutsi, and TWA. During the genocide and its aftermath, RPF soldiers reportedly killed many suspected of involvement in the genocide, with estimates from Human Rights Watch and scholars suggesting the toll may have reached up to 100,000. Some believe that these killings were either tolerated or orchestrated by the RPF leadership. Kagame has acknowledged that such killings occurred, but attributed them to rogue soldiers beyond control. International attention focused on these issues after the 1995 Kibeho massacre, where soldiers fired on a camp for displaced persons, killing an estimated 4,000 people according to UNAMIR's Australian soldiers, though the Rwandan government reported a lower toll of 338. In 2000, Kagame replaced Bizimungu as president and initiated an ambitious program to transform Rwanda into a middle-income country by 2020. The nation made impressive strides in development indicators such as the Human Development Index, healthcare and education. From 2004 to 2010, Rwanda saw annual economic growth averaging 8%. The poverty rate fell from 57% to 45% between 2006 and 2011, and life expectancy rose from 46.6 years in 2000 to 64.3 years by 2018. A reconciliation process also began, with courts established to try genocide suspects, including the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and 𝒂𝒂𝒏𝒅, a traditional village court system reintroduced to manage the high caseload. With women comprising a larger share of the post-war population and often uninvolved in the genocide, they were given leading roles in reconstruction and reconciliation efforts. Following the Rwandan Patriotic Front victory, about 2 million Hutus fled Rwanda, fearing reprisal for the Rwandan genocide, and took refuge in camps in neighboring countries, especially in Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. These United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees camps were overcrowded and unhygienic, leading to the spread of diseases like cholera and dysentery, which killed tens of thousands of refugees. Although the UNHCR set up the camps, Control was largely held by remnants of the former Hutu-led government and army, including genocide leaders, who began reorganizing and rearming with plans to reclaim power in Rwanda. By late 1996, Hutu militants from these camps began frequent cross-border attacks into Rwanda, prompting the Rwandan Patriotic Front-led Rwandan government to launch counter-offensive actions. Rwanda trained and supported the Banyamulenge, a Tutsi group in South Kivu, Zaire, who, with the support of Rwandan forces and local Tutsis, attacked the refugee camps, focusing on neutralizing the Hutu militia threat. This spurred mass migrations, with hundreds of thousands of refugees returning to Rwanda despite Rwandan Patriotic Front presence, while others fled further into Zaire. The Rwandan Patriotic Army pursued those moving deeper into Zaire, leading to the deaths of an estimated 232,000 individuals. Meanwhile, the defeated Hutu forces continued launching cross-border insurgencies with support from Rwanda's northwestern Hutu communities. However, by 1999, a strategy combining propaganda and integration of Hutus into the national army succeeded in quelling the insurgency. In addition to dismantling the refugee camps, Rwandan President Paul Kagame began planning to overthrow Zairean President Mobutu Sese Seko, who had supported the Hutu exiles and allowed attacks on Zairean Tutsis. Rwanda and Uganda backed an alliance of 4 rebel groups led by Laurent Désiré Kabila, sparking the First Congo War. The rebels swiftly seized North and South Kivu and advanced westward, facing minimal resistance from Mobutu's unmotivated army. By May 1997, they controlled the entire country, forcing Mobutu into exile and renaming Zaire the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In 1998, Rwanda's alliance with the new DRC government soured, prompting Kagame to support a second rebellion, leading to the Second Congo War. This conflict, lasting until 2003, caused millions of deaths and widespread devastation. A 2010 United Nations report accused the Rwandan Patriotic Army of extensive human rights abuses during both Congo wars, allegations which the Rwandan government denied. In 2015, Rwanda paid reparations to Uganda for damages sustained in Ugandan border regions during the conflicts. Please support us by subscribing to our channel Africarized. Follow us on TikTok, Facebook, X, and Instagram. Like, share, and leave a comment. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.